So if you haven't been with us, we're in the middle of a series that we've been doing where we've been walking through Jesus' famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. And so basically what we're going to be doing throughout the summer months is just walking through this famous teaching of Jesus chapter by chapter, verse by verse, Matthew 5 all the way through Matthew chapter 7. And in fact, if you've got your Bibles, let's go ahead and turn there. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 5. It's the last time, folks. We're wrapping up Matthew chapter 5 today. If you don't have a Bible, we should have Bibles in the chairs in front of you. If you've got one of those, we're going to be on page 811. I'm excited. There's all kinds of changes. It's been 810 for the last couple of weeks. So we're on page 811. And while you're turning there, I got to do a little bit of review just to catch everybody up, make sure we're all on the same page. Because again, this is one long continuous sermon, right? And so what we talk about every single week kind of sets the stage for what we talk about the next week. There's this natural flow from week to week to week. And so for the past couple of weeks, what Jesus has been talking about is what we would call the laws of retaliation. Basically, it's just the question, like, what do you do whenever somebody wrongs you? How do you respond when somebody hurts you? And so last week, Jesus said, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." And again, this phrase, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, in Hebrew, it's not literal, okay? This is what we call an idiom in Hebrew. And what it's talking about here is that the punishment should fit the crime. And when it talks about the punishment, what it's talking about here is financial compensation. And so by the first century, they had this entire system in place of crimes and then the punishment or how much the person would be rewarded. And so if you did this, this is how much they owed you. If you did this, this is how much they owed you. And the reason this was so important, and you guys know this, is that without those laws, without that system, our natural tendency whenever somebody hurts us is to get revenge, isn't it? And whenever we get revenge against somebody, have you ever noticed how we tend to raise the standard? We tend to escalate things because we have this mentality of whatever they did to me was worse than anything that I could do to them. This is why revenge always gets worse. And so this system was essential for their society because it curbed this sort of escalation. So Jesus says, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not get even with an evildoer." And again, the key to understanding this is that phrase, evildoer. What Jesus is not talking about here is somebody who wants to take responsibility. Because we've been there, right? We've all made mistakes. We felt bad. We wanted to make it right. We just wanted to do our part in order to show that we're really sorry. And so what he's not talking about here is somebody who wants to step up, take responsibility, and do the right thing. What Jesus is talking about, though, is somebody who wants to resist. Somebody who doesn't want to take responsibility for their actions. And so Jesus says, don't resist a person like that. And then he gives us a bunch of examples. He says, if somebody strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other. He says, if somebody wants your tunic, give them your cloak as well. If somebody asks you to carry something 1 mile, carry it 2. And I want you to notice the thread that connects every single one of these things is the way that we should respond to an evildoer is with kindness. But not just any kindness, not just kindness because we have to. We're to go over the top. We are to be people who exceed the expectations of others. And this whole conversation of how we respond to evildoers is right where we're going to pick up today. And so if you've got your Bible, I hope you're there because we're just going to dive right in. We're going to be in Matthew 5, beginning in verse 43. And this is a fun one. I love this one. It says this. Here we go. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, oftentimes when we see this phrase, you have heard it said, oftentimes this is a reference to something out of the Old Testament, right? We've been hopefully you know that. We've been talking about that every single week throughout this series. Oftentimes this is a reference to something out of the Old Testament. And so I think for a lot of us, what we do is we read this and we just kind of assume, okay, this is something obviously out of the Old Testament because we have this assumption, don't we? We have this assumption whenever we think about the Old Testament law, that the Old Testament law is rigid and firm and harsh. We stereotype it. And so when we read this, I think what we want to do is jump to the assumption that what Jesus is doing here is quoting the Old Testament law. But remember, I said often, there is an exceptions to the rule, and this is one of them. And again, we just kind of lump it in with the Old Testament law. And we do this for a couple of reasons. First of all, it fits the pattern, right? So far as we've gone through the series, every single time Jesus says, you have heard it said, he's referencing the Old Testament. And so obviously that's what he's doing here. But the other reason is because we stereotype it, because we assume that the law is harsh and rigid, we see things like hate your enemies and we're like, yeah, that fits. That makes sense, obviously. And so we accept it without even batting an eye. But the question I wanted to ask you as we get started, if that is in the Old Testament law, where is it? Where in the Old Testament law? No, wait. Where in the entire Old Testament do you ever see a reference to hating anybody at all? And the problem is it isn't there. And in fact, if you go through the Old Testament law, what you see time and time and time again is that God actually tells us to do the opposite. Couple quick examples. Leviticus 19:18 says this, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself, for I am the Lord. Notice the context here. Don't miss this. The context. Don't take vengeance. Don't bear a grudge. He's not talking in the law. It's not talking about people that we're really tight friends with here. That the context of this is when somebody wrongs you, when you're angry at somebody because they did something against you, your natural temptation is to be hateful to them, or at least the passive aggressive hateful, right? Like, okay, none of us know that one, right? That's our natural temptation, but look at what God is saying here. This is the Old Testament. It says, you shall not bear a grudge, you shall love your neighbors yourself. And then he says this, Exodus 23:4-5. If you meet your enemy's ox, not just any ox, your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring him back again. And if you see the donkey of the one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help it. How many times have you ever had that moment where you could passively, aggressively get back at somebody? Like maybe their car's broken down on the side of the road, and you have that moment where you drive past them and smile and wave as if some sort of like divine cosmic karma was being fulfilled, right? You see, what God is saying here is if you see your neighbor broken down, help them out. Or if you see your neighbor's dog running loose, and maybe that dog drives you crazy. You ever have a neighbor that had a dog that just woke you up really early and barked incessantly all the time? I think that's our dog, by the way. I think we're that neighbor. But what if you saw that dog wandering the street, and there's that temptation to just let it go. Let nature take its course. I don't know that any of the neighbors would complain. It would be nice to sleep past 5:30, wouldn't it? But what God is saying here is you even need to help them. That when it comes to loving, there should be no limits, there should be no boundaries. That you are to love your neighbor as yourself. That includes the people you have a grudge with. That includes the people that you want to get vengeance with. That as you go through the Old Testament law, and again, I love using that context of the Old Testament law because our stereotype, our assumption is that it's harsh, it's rigid, it's legalistic. But when we really begin to look at it, you see that it's filled with grace, love, mercy, and compassion. And so if the Old Testament law never says anything about hating your enemies, the question that we absolutely have to ask is, where in the world does Jesus get this phrase? He didn't just come up with it, right? He didn't just pick a random phrase to preach against and everybody's like, what's he talking about? I don't know. You see, this phrase, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, is a phrase that was commonly used by a group of people in the first century known as the Essenes. Now, if you've been with us before, you might be a little bit familiar with that name. I love the Essenes personally. They're a really, really fascinating group of people. And what I love about them is even though we don't see that name Essene anywhere in the New Testament, if you're familiar with the Essene writings, by the way, some of you may be familiar with them by another name, the Qumran community or the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's those guys. And if you get familiar with their writings and some of their sayings, what you begin to see is that even though the name Essene isn't used anywhere in the New Testament, their fingerprints are absolutely all over the gospel stories. They are absolutely everywhere. And in fact, I think that the Essenes were a large group that began to be the early adopters and early followers of Jesus. Now, just because they adopted Jesus early on, it doesn't mean they agreed with everything that he said. In fact, Jesus is oftentimes pushing back against these guys because of some of their beliefs. Now, in order to get into that, we got to look at a little bit of the background of the Essenes, because the Essenes, again, fascinating group of people. They were a desert people, a desert community. They left society altogether and lived in the desert. In fact, they had these entire aqueduct systems that were designed to get water into the desert so that they could live. Now, the reason they moved into the desert is because they got really disenfranchised with society, and especially with the priests of Israel. Remember, the priests, when we talk about the priesthood, they are supposed to be our example. They are the ones who are supposed to show us what it looks like to be faithful followers of God. And the problem is that by the first century, the priests, by and large, and again, there are exceptions to the rule, but by and large, the priests were living a very, very, very Roman lifestyle. And when I talk about living a Roman lifestyle, understand, everything the Romans did was wrapped up in pagan worship. You couldn't even go to the theater without being involved with worshiping the other gods. Are you with me? And so these priests were very much committed to the Roman lifestyle. And the reason they were is because they looked at the Roman expansion and said, you know what? The whole world is going Roman anyway. Why fight culture? You know, the thing I love about the Bible is it's the things they wrestled with thousands of years ago are the same things that we wrestle with today, right? The priest said, why fight culture? The whole world's going that way anyway. And so they lived an entirely Roman lifestyle, except for their time at the temple. But check this out. By the time the first century came around, there were so many priests and there were so few jobs to do at the temple. There were like too many cooks for the kitchen, right? And so they actually had to break the priesthood up into 24 different groups. And of those 24 different groups, every priest would serve 2 weeks a year, which sounds like a pretty sweet job, right? Of those 2 weeks a year, there were still so many priests that they had to cast lots to see who would actually get to do some of the acts of worship. Most priests would go their entire life without ever doing a thing. That's crazy, isn't it? And so there was this sharp, clear divide between their work life and their social life. Now, the Essenes were disenfranchised with this priesthood. And so the reason they went out into the desert is because they were convicted. You see, the Essenes believed that one day God would send his Messiah. And one of the things the Messiah would do, remember, the Messiah, from their point of view, was going to reestablish Israel's place of prominence among the nations. And so when the Messiah came, he was going to drive out the Romans. And with that, he was going to drive out the corrupt priests as well. Well, from their point of view, that creates a problem, doesn't it? If the Messiah drives out all the priests, who are going to be the priests? The Messiah is going to have priests. Israel can't function without priests. And so they started praying. And they came across a verse in Isaiah 40, verse 3, that says, behold, the voice of one calling out in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord. And they said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go out into the wilderness, and we are going to prepare ourselves to be the priests of Israel, so that when the Messiah comes and he drives out the corrupt priesthood, we will be ready to take their place. Now, you're probably wondering, great, Brian, but what in the world does all of this have to do with loving your neighbor and hating your enemy? Great question. Glad you asked. If you're the kind of person, think about this for a minute. Just think logically. If you're the kind of person who is so passionate, so extreme, that you're going to leave society altogether to go live into the desert, right? That's usually a pretty extreme person, isn't it? I don't know about you. I've thought about ideas like that. Going off the grid, cabin in the woods. It sounds great until I think about the act of chopping wood, or hunting, or anything that doesn't involve a remote, right? Like, it takes an extreme person to actually do that. And what we see with the Essenes is that they were extreme, not only with their actions in their life, but also with their theology. Now, I've got to take a minute and go into a little bit of theology to help set the stage here. You see, the Essenes believed in what they would call predestination. And when the Essenes talk about predestination, what they're talking about here is that before time, God had predestined certain people to be his children. Those people were known as the children of light. Let me ask you, if you go through the story of Jesus, how often do you see that phrase, sons of light or children of light? That's an Essene phrase. Jesus, when he uses that phrase, is probably talking to a group of people that at least have some population of Essenes, right? So they were known as the sons, the children of light. They were also known as the children of our fathers, sons of our fathers, something like that. And so they were predestined. They don't have a choice in this. They were chosen to be God's people, which means some people were chosen to not be God's people. Those people were known as the children of darkness, or the men of the pit. Now, think about this. If some people were chosen to be gods, and some were chosen to be evil, right? And the people who are evil, they're never going to change. This is the way that they are. The Essenes had developed this mentality that because those people are evil, we can actually treat them as badly as we want to, because they're never going to change. They are men of the pit. They are sons of darkness. And so if you go through the Essene writings, you see this mentality just all over the place. All the time, they would say things like, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. They would tell us to hate the children of darkness. And then my personal favorite, check this one out, that you should have, quote unquote, an eternal hatred for the men of the pit. Do you see the problem? Do you see where all this goes wrong? The problem is that what the Essenes had done is they had created this entire theology to justify hating people who didn't agree with them, which sounds like our political system, doesn't it? I was on Twitter not that long ago, and there's a reason I'm not on it that often. If you're on Twitter, you know. But I was looking at people talking about politics for some reason. I was at a low moment, I guess. I knew better. But I noticed that there was this one that had been shared tens, hundreds of thousands of times. And the tweet itself was talking about justifying hatred to people who vote differently than them. That we live in a culture that is so much like their culture. You see, the Essenes had justified hating people who were different from them and who believed differently from them, because if they were darkness, then they were never going to change. And so Jesus says, you have heard it said to love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but don't miss what he says next. Verse 44, but I say to you, love your enemies. and pray for those who persecute you. By the way, when Jesus talks about loving your enemies, love your enemies. I got that right. What Jesus is doing here is he's stepping into a very big debate in the first century world. The way that we debate things like healthcare and immigration, they would have debated questions about the law. One of the biggest questions they would debate is the question, who is your neighbor? Right? The rabbis read that. They're like, okay, wait, who is your neighbor? Because surely God doesn't expect me to love everybody. That's a lot of people. It's a lot of love to go around. And I don't know if you've met my neighbors, but some of my neighbors are kind of unlovable. And so the rabbis in the first century had all these different views. Some of them, check this out, would actually say the only people that you have to love are religious Jews. Others would say religious and non-religious Jews, but you don't have to love those Gentiles. Some would say, well, you need to love religious Jews and non-religious Jews and religious Gentiles, but not non-religious Gentiles. And then some would say, you know what, religious, non-religious Jews, religious, non-religious Gentiles, you need to love them all. Jesus here ups the ante. He says you need to love your enemies. And this isn't the first time Jesus jumps into this conversation. You guys remember the story where some kid comes up to Jesus? He's an up-and-coming rabbi. He says, teacher, what is the first and greatest commandment? Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Love your neighbors yourself. Kid's like, that was a weak question. I got to come up with a better one. He says, okay, wait. But who is your neighbor? It's like a philosopher. What do you mean when you use the word and, right? Who is your neighbor? Jesus says, well, let me tell you a story. And he goes on to tell the story of the Good Samaritan. Understand, Samaritans in the first century world were the most hated people you can imagine. If a Samaritan found himself in a Jewish community, it wouldn't have been surprising if somebody would have stabbed him and tried to kill him. They had an extreme hatred for Samaritans. So much so that the rabbis who were debating who to love, even the most loving one would have never said a Samaritan. Jesus is always pushing our boundaries. Jesus is always going above and beyond with the people that we are called to love. We are not just called to love some people, we are called to love all people. The grace of God isn't just for some people, it's for everybody. And that's Jesus' next point here. Because he says to love your enemies, and then what does he say? To pray for those who persecute you. Why do you pray for somebody? What's the motivation behind that? It's to change, right? It's that God would change their heart. But let me ask you something. If the Essenes are right and they're never going to change, then why would you pray for somebody? You see, the good news of Jesus is that the grace of God is for everybody. That there are no boundaries, there are no limits, there are no restrictions. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called good news, right? It'd be called okay news. As long as you're with them, it's good. Sorry, I didn't mean to point at this side of the room. You guys count too. You see, I can't tell you how many times I'll have a conversation with somebody about Jesus and they'll say, yeah, but you don't know what I've done. That if you've only understood the mistakes that I've made, if you only knew the people that I've hurt, the people that I've wronged, the people I've betrayed, if you only understood the skeletons in my closet, you would understand how God could never forgive me. You see, the good news of Jesus is nobody is too far gone. No matter how badly we've messed up, no matter how deeply we've hurt other people, none of us are beyond the reach of God's grace. That when Jesus died on that cross, he didn't just die for the perfect or the religious. He died for everybody. And that all of us have the choice to follow him and say yes to Jesus. It says, love your enemies, pray for those that persecute you. He goes on, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Jesus is saying, look, you claim to be sons of light. You claim to have the superiority over other people. But if you want to really live as sons of light or sons of the Father, then you need to be the kind of person that loves your enemies. And if the person that you are enemies with is persecuting you, you need to pray for them. That is how you live as real sons of light. And then he goes on, for he, being God, makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. You see, the reason that we are to show grace even to the most ungraceful people is because God does. That God doesn't just give sunlight to some people, right? I mean, I know sometimes it feels that way because we've had a lot of cloudy days lately. But God sends light to everybody. Same thing with rain. It just doesn't rain on my house and not on their house because, well, they're my neighbor. And obviously they're a son of darkness because, well, I've seen what they do. Like, that's not the way that things work. That God shows grace to everybody. He doesn't pick and choose. And then he goes on. He says this, for if you love those who love you, well, what reward is that? He says, do not even the tax collectors do the same thing. Remember, tax collectors were seen as traitors. These are people who sold out to Rome, people who were taking Jewish money and giving it to Rome. They were the worst of the worst. Tax collectors were labeled sinners, and as a sinner, you were a permanent outcast of God's community. And so what Jesus is saying here is, look, if you only love the people who love you, then what good is that? Like, even the tax collectors do that. He goes on, and if you only greet your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even Gentiles do the same? You see, what Jesus is saying here is that you claim to be children of light, but children of light are meant to live a different life. And right now, you're living like everybody else because you're only kind. You're only showing grace to the people who believe like you and think like you and act like you. You're only showing grace to the people of your community. But even the tax collectors do that. Even the Gentiles do that. You're not living as grace. That is the bare minimum of what it means to live a humane life. That's the bare minimum. To love the people who love you, that's easy, isn't it? Any of us can do that. But Jesus, again, is calling us to a higher standard. And then he says this, and we all hate this verse. He says, you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. I wonder how many of us, when we hear those words, want to throw it out. Because we look at that and say, you know what? None of us can be perfect. That we have all messed up. We've all made mistakes. And because we've all made mistakes, like, that's clearly not for us. And so our temptation is to throw it out, and we need to be very, very careful. If you've been with us before, one of the things that we've talked about is that in the Hebrew, words are all about the word picture, right? It's all about the picture that they create. When you think about perfect, I want you to think about a puzzle. You ever put one together? I know they're kind of out of style. But you ever have that moment where you're putting together a puzzle and you've kind of got that like nervous energy because you're worried that you're going to be missing a piece? Do you know what I mean? In fact, I don't even care if I get it all together. I just want to know that all the pieces are there. And so there's like this nervous energy that I'm going to be missing something. And then there's that satisfaction, right? When you get near the end, you realize you actually have all the pieces and this is going to work. See, when that puzzle becomes complete, it's perfect, it's whole, it's not lacking anything. But if it's missing something, if it's missing a piece, well, then it's imperfect. Then it's broken. By the way, this is also a picture of sin. See, sin is the decisions that we make that steal our puzzle pieces. It pulls us away from the life that God is calling you to live. But we are called to live a life of completion or wholeness, a life full of submission to God's will. And that means being generous, being loving, being kind to the people that we want nothing to do with. And I'm not even just talking about it because you have to do it. I'm talking about over the top. That we are to be people who go above and beyond when it comes to our grace. And in fact, I'm going to let you in on a secret. You want to know how to step into the will of God for your life? You want to know how to live the life God's calling you to live? Here's the secret. You do it. You show grace, love, compassion, kindness, mercy, generosity to the people around you. See, the problem I think we have whenever we talk about God's will for our life, I think we tend to read that through the lens of the hero's journey. You guys familiar with the hero's journey? It's a storytelling device that every hero goes through. It's this plot that every hero is kind of put into this formula. If you ever want to know what it is, just watch Star Wars: A New Hope. I'm telling you, Luke Skywalker fits it perfectly. Almost every hero that we watch does it. And the reason that we struggle with God's will is because what we do is we place ourselves in the hero's journey. Part of the hero's journey is that you have an ordinary person living in an ordinary world, right? When something extraordinary happens and forces that person outside of the ordinary. You see, I think a lot of us are waiting for the extraordinary to happen to us. I think so many of us are sitting around waiting for God to come around and kick us in the butt and force us to do something that we don't really want to do, but we have to do it and we don't have a choice. But that's not the way it works. You see, what I know about God is that you're not here by accident. You're not in your jobs by accident. The people in your life are not there by accident. That God has intentionally brought people into your life. And the question that we need to ask ourselves with the relationships and our situations is, how are we stepping into God's will for those moments? How am I being generous with the people that God's placed around me? How am I showing kindness to even the enemies that God's put in front of me? How do I show generosity? See, this is the thing about living a life of grace. We love it when grace is on us, right? I like receiving grace. How about you? Ask my wife. I require a lot of grace sometimes. I don't like giving grace. Giving grace is hard, isn't it? And what's interesting is that this whole sermon so far has been about Jesus showing us how to live a life of grace. See, when we talk about the law, part of what we're talking about is the bare minimum of what it means to live a humane life. For example, law said don't murder. That's the minimum, right? Like, if you want to function in society, the bare minimum, don't kill people. It's a good way to start. But if you want to live a life of grace, you got to get that anger in check. Law says don't commit adultery. I'm telling you guys, if you want a healthy marriage, the bare minimum, don't cheat on your spouse. Just rule of thumb. But if you want to live a life of extraordinary grace, you control the lust in your heart. Jesus says in verse 42, the last one we finished with last week, says, give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. You see, the law says you give 10%. Grace says you're free to give as much as your heart desires. 20, 30, 40. There are no restrictions. There are no limits. There are no boundaries to the giving that you can give. You see, Matthew 5 is about how we live a life of grace. How we begin to go above and beyond in the everyday parts of life. And I am telling you, if you begin to do the little things, if you begin by investing in the people that God has brought to you, if you begin by showing kindness, even to that person that drives you crazy, or maybe it's even as simple, I'm telling you, this one little thing is going to make such a big difference. If you go out to eat and you are kind to your server, it will make I literally was nice to a person who sat me once. I came back the next time and she was talking about how that made her day. My daughter looked at me and said, what did you do? I said, I smiled. I don't know. Like, guys, I'm telling you, little things, acts of grace, while they sometimes seem like a burden to us, make all the difference in the world. And if we want to be children of light, we have to live a life that's going above and beyond. We have to live a life that is actually living out the light of the world around us. Because as Jesus said, if you don't, well, then you're not really different than anybody else. So the question I want to ask is what are the opportunities in front of us today or tomorrow when you get back to normal life that God has put in front of you? Maybe it's something little, maybe it's something big. God is saying, go talk to them. Be kind to them. Be generous with them. I don't know what it is for you, but I'm telling you though, if you begin to live a life of radical generosity and kindness and grace and mercy, you are going to begin to see God work in your life like you never imagined. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you for today. God, we thank you for your grace. We thank you that none of us are beyond your reach. That when Jesus died on the cross, he died for everyone. That everyone, no matter how badly we messed up, we have the opportunity to come to you. We have the opportunity to receive your salvation. God, it's only through Jesus. It's not by doing enough good things. It's not by paying it back. God, we thank you for Jesus and his death so that we could be set free. But God, we have responsibility as well. I pray that you would show us the opportunities that you're placing in front of us. And yeah, they're going to be hard. Sometimes they're extremely uncomfortable because you're always calling us outside of our comfort zone. You're always calling us onto the waters. God, give us eyes to see the opportunities that you've placed in front of us. And courage to take those next steps, even when it seems impossible, because we know that through you, anything is possible. Thank you again for today, God. In Jesus' name, amen.